What would you do if the safest place you trusted, the seat beside your child, suddenly became the place of their deepest pain? On a flight that should have been ordinary, a young black boy was struck so violently by a flight attendant that his nose broke in front of an entire cabin. His cries filled the air, and yet, for a moment, silence was louder than compassion. Passengers looked on, torn between disbelief and fear. And in that silence came a choice every one of us might face one day. Do we speak up, or do we turn away? Now imagine it was your son, your grandson, or even the child you once were. Would you have stayed seated, or would you have stood for what was right? What no one on that plane knew was that this boy's father wasn't just another passenger. He was a man with both power and principle, someone who would turn this injustice into a reckoning far greater than anyone imagined. This is their story, and perhaps a mirror for us all. If you feel this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, because the truth deserves to be heard. Blood trickled down 12-year-old Jordan Ellington's face, painting his blue polo in streaks of red. The sharp metallic scent filled the first-class cabin. Gas echoed as passengers leaned out of their seats, phones raised, recording what they could hardly believe. Jordan's mother, Nadine, dropped to her knees. Her hands trembled as she tried to cradle her son's face. Napkins pressed against his nose, which had already begun to swell. "Oh, God, my baby," she whispered, her voice breaking, though her eyes burned with fury. Across from them stood Karen Holt, a senior flight attendant with 20 years in the skies. Her neatly tied blonde bun and crisp uniform were supposed to represent poise and professionalism. But at this moment, her face was twisted in indignation. "He pulled away from me," Karen snapped, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "That's assault on a crew member." Passengers stared in disbelief. Some shook their heads, murmuring. Others fumbled to unlock their phones, pressing record. That boy did nothing wrong. An older woman whispered sharply from row 4. A man in a suit muttered, "I saw her shove him." But Karen doubled down, her voice rising as if volume alone could rewrite the truth. "He came at me aggressively. I had no choice." No choice. Nadine's voice cut through the air like a blade. She looked up, her palms stained with her son's blood. "He's a child. He weighs barely 80 pounds. "You slammed him into that seat," Jordan whimpered. His eyes squeezed shut, his voice muffled. "It hurts. Mom, it hurts." The image was seared into every witness's mind. An innocent black child, injured, shaking, while a woman in uniform tried to spin the story in her favor. At the front of the cabin, a man stirred. Richard Calloway, a middle-aged real estate investor with a tailored gray suit, leaned back with smug detachment. "Some kids don't know how to behave," he said under his breath, but not under his breath enough. Passengers nearby turned to glare at him, their disgust plain. Nadine held her son tighter. Every fiber of her being screamed to protect him. But she also knew the danger of this moment, how quickly authority sided with uniform over truth, how easily the narrative could turn her son into a threat. The boy wasn't a threat. He was her child. She pulled out her phone with her free hand, hit record, and held it steady. If they tried to twist this, there would be evidence. This time, there would be no erasing what happened. Karen noticed and barked, "Ma'am, you can't film crew members. It's against airline policy." "Policy," Nadine shot back, her voice shaking but firm. "Show me where policy justifies breaking a child's nose." The tension grew so thick the air seemed heavy. Even the engine's steady roar felt distant, muffled under the pounding of hearts in the cabin. A few rows back, Luis Martinez, the youngest flight attendant on board, froze with a tray of half-served drinks in his hands. His dark eyes darted between Karen and Nadine. He knew what he'd seen. He knew the truth. But should he speak or stay silent? Protect his career? His throat tightened. Meanwhile, Jordan's small body shuddered. The napkins were soaked through. His voice came out faint and nasal. "Mom, did I do something wrong?" That single question shattered Nadine. Her boy, her bright-eyed son who loved model airplanes and dreamed of being a pilot like his father, was sitting there bleeding, asking if he was the problem. "You did nothing wrong," she whispered fiercely into his ear. "Nothing." Phones kept rolling. Murmurs rippled through the cabin. What started as whispers had grown into a hum of outrage. "Somebody needs to call the captain." "Where's the captain? They can't just let this go." Karen crossed her arms, trying to reclaim control. "I'll notify the cockpit. Security will be waiting when we land. This boy assaulted me, and his mother is interfering with crew duties. They'll both be escorted off." At those words, Nadine felt her stomach drop. She'd lived long enough to know the danger in that threat. Her son bleeding. Her voice dismissed. A narrative twisted against them. But fate had other plans. Because at that very moment, the cockpit door clicked. The sound was subtle, but in the tense silence, it might as well have been a thunderclap. Every head turned as the reinforced door began to swing open. A tall figure in a crisp uniform stepped into the aisle, 4 golden stripes gleaming on his shoulders. His face, calm and commanding, scanned the scene until his eyes landed on the boy drenched in blood. The mask of professionalism cracked in an instant. "Jordan." His voice thundered, raw with shock. The cabin froze. Phones captured every angle. Karen's confident posture faltered, confusion flickering across her face. She looked at the captain, then at the child, then back again. Nadine's lips trembled, but her words came steady. "Captain Ellington, it's your son." And in that breathless second, Karen Holt realized the nightmare truth. The boy she had just shoved, the boy she had left bleeding in first class, was the son of the man commanding the entire flight. Hours earlier, the Ellington family had moved through the familiar chaos of LaGuardia Airport. The morning sun slanted through the glass walls, turning the polished floor into a shifting mosaic of light and shadow. Nadine walked beside her son, her tote bag looped over one arm, her other hand resting gently on Jordan's shoulder. He carried his small backpack with pride, the straps cutting slightly into his thin frame, but he refused to let her help. He was 12 now, almost a teenager, old enough, he insisted, to handle his own bag. Their flight was bound for Dallas, where Marcus, Jordan's father, was waiting. He had flown down 2 days earlier to meet with Horizon Airways executives about a new diversity initiative. It was more than business, it was personal. Marcus Ellington, one of the very few black captains at a major U.S. airline, knew better than most how rare it was for someone like him to be given the authority of the captain's chair. Jordan looked up at his mother as they waited near the gate. "Mom, do you think Dad will take me inside the cockpit this time?" His eyes shone with the same curiosity that had defined him since he could talk. Airplanes were more than machines to him. They were dreams with wings. Nadine smiled, brushing back a stray curl from his forehead. "You know your father. If the schedule allows it, he'll make sure you get a look. But remember, you don't need a cockpit tour to prove you belong there one day. You already carry that in your heart." Jordan's grin widened. He was wearing a navy cap embroidered with a tiny set of golden wings Marcus had given him after his first simulator ride. He touched the brim now, like a promise. At the gate, the announcements crackled. Boarding groups called out. Nadine pulled out their first-class tickets. They weren't in the habit of extravagance, but Marcus had insisted. "If you're traveling alone with Jordan, you take the seats you deserve," he'd told her, "not because of the status, because you've earned peace." Nadine. She had argued it wasn't her style to flaunt comfort, but deep down she knew he was right. Too often, traveling while black came with eyes that followed. Assumptions that cut. Words muttered loud enough to sting. First class wouldn't shield them completely, but it offered a layer of distance. When they stepped into the priority boarding lane, Nadine felt the eyes on them. She was used to it. The silent math people did in their heads. Did they belong here? Did they afford it legitimately? She had taught herself to square her shoulders, to offer a polite smile, to resist the temptation to explain her life to strangers. Jordan noticed too. He leaned closer and whispered, "Why are people staring?" "They're curious," she replied softly, though her stomach nodded. "But let them wonder. We know who we are." Inside the cabin, the leather seats gleamed, pillows stacked neatly, screens lit with the airline logo. Jordan pressed his face to the window immediately, his reflection superimposed over the tarmac outside. Nadine settled their bags, glancing around as passengers trickled in. She noticed the senior attendant, First Karen Holt, her blonde bun perfect, her smile practiced. It wasn't the smile that bothered Nadine. It was the flicker of surprise in the woman's eyes, the half-second pause as if recalibrating expectations. Karen's voice carried a note of forced brightness as she said, "Welcome aboard." But Nadine heard the strain. Jordan, lost in excitement, didn't. A few rows behind them, a man in a steel-gray suit slung his garment bag into the overhead compartment with a thud. Richard Calloway didn't bother to lower his voice when he asked Karen, "First class is full today." "Yes, Mr. Calloway." Karen replied with warmth that hadn't touched Nadine. "Completely full." His eyes flicked toward Nadine and Jordan, lingering longer than courtesy allowed. A faint smirk touched his lips before he slid into his seat. Nadine felt heat rise in her chest. She looked away, squeezing Jordan's hand, not wanting to spoil his mood. Jordan's enthusiasm was boundless. "Mom, look how close we are to the wing. I can see the flaps." He mimed moving levers with his hands, his voice bubbling with fascination. Nadine let herself laugh softly, her heart aching at how pure his joy was, untouched for the moment by the weight pressing in from the world. She thought of Marcus and Dallas, waiting. He would have reminded her. Let him dream without limits. Nadine, don't let the world clip his wings before he can test them. Yet a shadow followed her thoughts. She remembered the grocery store incident last year, when a clerk had tailed Jordan down every aisle, assuming theft because of the color of his skin. She remembered the police cruiser that slowed as Jordan rode his bike through their own neighborhood, the officer's eyes narrowing through the window. Each memory sat heavy in her chest. Mom Jordan's voice broke through her reverie. "Are you okay?" She forced her smile to return. "I'm fine, baby. Just thinking about Dad." "Yes." She lied gently. She wouldn't burden him with the truth that she was always thinking about what the world might do to him, about how fragile safety really was. The cabin filled with passengers, the hum of conversation rising. Luis Martinez, the junior flight attendant, moved carefully through the aisle, stowing bags for elderly travelers, offering genuine smiles. Nadine noticed his warmth instantly, a stark contrast to Karen's rigid professionalism. Louis paused when he saw Jordan fiddling with his seatbelt. He crouched down, showing him how the latch clicked, his voice kind. Jordan's face lit up. "Thanks." Louis winked. "Future pilot. Huh." Jordan nodded enthusiastically. "One day, yes." Nadine saw the exchange, and a flicker of relief softened her chest. Not everyone saw her son as a problem. Some still saw him as a boy with dreams. The intercom crackled. "Cabin crew, prepare for departure." The doors closed, sealing them into the metal capsule that would carry them across the country. Nadine adjusted her seatbelt, leaned back, and let the low rumble of the engines vibrate through her bones. She didn't know what awaited them in the hours ahead. She only knew this. She had promised herself long ago that she would protect her son's light, no matter the darkness around them. And as the plane began to taxi, Jordan pressed his forehead to the window, whispering under his breath, "Someday, I'll be the one flying this plane." His mother smiled at him, hiding her unease, unaware that before the flight was over, the boy's dream would be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. Nadine had always carried a quiet strength. To outsiders, she seemed composed, a woman who could handle herself in any room, whether at a university lecture hall or a crowded airport terminal. But inside, she carried a storm, a constant awareness of how fragile dignity could be, especially for her son. As the plane climbed through the low clouds, Jordan leaned forward, glued to the window, marveling at the tiny cars below shrinking into toy-sized dots. His voice was a gentle hum of wonder. Nadine, however, sat stiff in her seat. Her eyes flicked between her son and the crew moving in the aisle. She noticed every pause, every sideways glance, every tiny sign that Jordan's presence was being measured differently. Karen walked past, her polished shoes tapping against the aisle floor. She didn't even look down at Jordan, though her lips pressed into a thin line when she caught Nadine's eyes. Nadine knew that look. She'd seen it in boardrooms and department stores, in PTA meetings and parking lots, suspicion packaged as politeness, disdain hidden behind professional smiles. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She couldn't shield Jordan from the world forever, but she could prepare him. "Mom," Jordan whispered, tugging at her sleeve. "Why does she look so mad? We didn't even do anything." Her heart sank. He had noticed. She wanted to tell him it was nothing, that he was imagining it. But she refused to lie to her son. Instead, she bent closer, keeping her voice low. "Some people carry storms inside them. Jordan, they don't know how to see clearly. That doesn't mean you've done anything wrong." Jordan frowned. "But it feels like I'm already in trouble." Nadine brushed his cheek with the back of her hand. "You're not. You're safe with me. Don't ever forget that." He nodded, but his shoulders hunched a little. She recognized that posture, the shrinking in on himself. It was the same look he had worn when a store guard had trailed them for no reason last Christmas. It was the same slump she saw when he came home from school after being accused of copying answers, even though he was simply smarter than the rest of the class. She clenched her fists in her lap, nails digging into her palms. She had promised Marcus she'd protect their boy's joy. But joy was fragile. It could be broken in a single careless moment. The seatbelt sign switched off with a soft chime. Jordan perked up immediately, turning toward the screen in front of him, scrolling through the movies. Nadine watched him select a documentary on aircraft design. Of course, he had no interest in cartoons. Her boy wanted to understand wings, engines, how a massive body of metal stayed in the air. Karen reappeared with the drink cart. Her voice was syrupy sweet for the passengers in row 1. "Can I get you champagne? Sparkling water? Anything at all?" They responded warmly, laughter bubbling into the air. But when she reached Nadine and Jordan, the sweetness faded. Her smile thinned. The warmth cooled. "Something to drink?" she asked flatly. "Orange juice for him. Coffee for me. Please," Nadine said politely. Karen's hand hesitated just slightly before pouring. Nadine caught it. Jordan noticed too. His brows knit together, and he looked down at his lap, shrinking again. Luis followed with napkins and snacks. When he reached their row, his smile returned. "Here you go, buddy," he said to Jordan, handing him extra pretzels. "Fuel for future pilots." Jordan's grin returned. "Thanks, Nadine," shot Luis a grateful look. He nodded quickly, then moved on, careful not to attract attention from Karen. For a brief moment, Nadine let her guard down, but then she heard Richard Calloway's voice drift from 2 rows back. "Some folks think first class means anyone with a credit card can walk in." He didn't lower his voice enough. He wanted to be heard. Nadine stiffened. Jordan froze. She turned, locking eyes with Calloway. His smile was smug, self-satisfied, the kind that dared her to respond so he could play the victim later. She turned back slowly, her jaw tight. She'd learned long ago which battles could be fought in the moment, and which had to wait. Still, the anger burned inside her chest. Jordan whispered, "Mom, did he mean us?" Her throat tightened. She chose her words carefully. Sometimes people say things that are meant to hurt. The important thing is knowing their words don't define us. He nodded, though confusion clouded his eyes. He was 12, old enough to sense the poison, but not old enough to know how to shield against it. As the cabin settled, Nadine found herself staring at the back of Karen's uniform as the attendant worked her way down the aisle. Questions swirled in her head. Should she confront her now? Should she report her later? Would anyone even believe her? She remembered a board meeting Marcus once described how he had been talked over, dismissed, until he revealed his title. Only then had the room fallen silent. Authority mattered. Without it, truth was fragile. Her pulse quickened as she looked at her son, sipping orange juice through a straw, trying to pretend he hadn't heard what he had heard, trying to carry the dream of flying in a world that too often clipped wings. She whispered silently to herself, a mantra she had carried for years. Protect him, prepare him, preserve him. Jordan nudged her arm. "When we land, can we go to Dad's favorite diner?" His smile returned, small but bright. The one with the giant pancakes. Nadine exhaled slowly, forcing herself to smile back. "Of course, sweetheart. Giant pancakes it is." He leaned his head against her shoulder, drifting toward the screen again. For now, he was content. For now, his innocence still lingered. But Nadine knew better than to believe the storm had passed. She could feel it building, quiet and unseen, waiting for the moment to break. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady and reassuring to most of the passengers. But Nadine heard it like a low drumbeat, amplifying the tension that lingered just beneath the polite surface. She could feel the storm gathering. Every time Karen passed their row, the woman's eyes flicked toward Jordan with a sharpness that felt less like observation and more like judgment. Jordan tried to ignore it. He leaned back with his tablet, drawing sketches of airplanes, carefully marking wings and tails, his brow furrowed with concentration. But Nadine knew him well enough to notice the tiny twitch of his foot under the seat, a nervous rhythm he always slipped into when he felt watched. Behind them, Richard Calloway spoke into his phone before the doors closed for signal loss, his voice dripping arrogance. "Yes, close on the property. They'll fold. People always fold if you keep the pressure on." He laughed, as if the idea of bending people's will was sport. When he hung up, his eyes scanned the cabin until they settled on Jordan again. This time he didn't smirk. He sneered. Louis moved quietly between rows, gathering cups, checking belts, offering smiles. He slowed near Nadine's row, glancing at Jordan's sketch. "That's a sharp wing design, buddy," he said softly. "Looks like something you'd see in a NASA prototype." Jordan brightened. "Really, I was thinking about adding extra flaps here." He pointed at the sketch. Louis leaned closer. "Smart. Extra control and turbulence. You've got an engineer's brain." He gave Nadine a quick, almost apologetic smile before moving on. Nadine felt a swell of gratitude toward the young attendant. But just behind him, Karen appeared again, her eyes narrowing as she caught the exchange. When Louise passed her, she whispered something under her breath, too low for Nadine to hear, but the flicker of guilt on his face said enough. The drink service continued, chatter rising and falling like waves. Yet Nadine couldn't shake the feeling that her family was an island in the middle of it all, under constant scrutiny. She shifted in her seat, trying to breathe through the weight pressing against her chest. Jordan tugged on her sleeve. "Mom, do you think Dad ever feels nervous flying?" She looked at him, surprised by the question. "Nervous your father?" "Yeah," Jordan said. "Like, does he ever worry that something will go wrong? Or that people don't trust him because he's—" He hesitated, eyes darting toward Karen. "Because he's Dad." Her breath caught. He was too young to ask questions like that. And yet here he was. She thought carefully, every word balancing truth with protection. "Your father feels everything. Jordan. Responsibility. Pressure. But he also feels pride. And he knows his worth. That's why he's where he is today." Jordan nodded slowly, chewing on her words. "I want to be like him." Her chest ached with both love and fear. "And you will. But not because you're him. Because you're you." The meal service began soon after. Nadine accepted hers with quiet politeness. But when the tray was set down in front of Jordan, something shifted. His portion was missing the entree listed on the menu. Instead, a smaller plate with just crackers and cheese appeared. "Excuse me," Nadine said, keeping her voice even. "He ordered the chicken. I confirmed it when we booked." Karen's smile was thin, her tone clipped. "We ran out." Nadine looked around. Every passenger in their row had received the meal, including a young man who had boarded last. Her jaw tightened. She knew what this was. She pressed her lips together, not wanting to make a scene. But Jordan glanced at the plates beside him, his shoulders sagging. "It's okay." "Mom," he whispered, "I'm not that hungry." Her heart cracked at the words. It wasn't about the food. It was about dignity, about what he was being told without words that he didn't belong, that his comfort was negotiable. Luis appeared again, his brow furrowed. He whispered quickly, "I'll check the galley." Minutes later, he returned with a proper meal, sliding it onto Jordan's tray with a quiet nod. Karen's eyes cut toward him, sharp enough to slice. He didn't flinch, but Nadine could see the tension in his jaw. Richard chuckled behind them, loud enough for all to hear. "Can't expect special treatment just because you think you're special." His fork clinked against his plate as he savored his chicken. Jordan's ears burned red. Nadine's pulse hammered. She wanted to whirl around, to shout back, to strip the smugness from his voice. But she held her tongue. She had learned to play the long game. The cabin lights dimmed for the meal service. Soft music hummed through the speakers, but the tension didn't fade. Nadine picked at her food, her mind racing. Every slight, every glance, every word was layering one atop another. She could feel the weight building, pressing toward a breaking point. Jordan leaned his head on her arm, silent now. She stroked his hair, her heart aching with the unfairness of it all. She whispered under her breath, so low only he could hear, "You belong here. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The engines droned on, the plane slicing through the night sky, and though no one spoke of it, though the cabin hummed with the illusion of calm, Nadine knew the storm was only just beginning. The hum of the cabin deepened as the meal trays were cleared away. The lights dimmed to a warm glow that encouraged rest. For many passengers, the flight was just another stretch of sky to be endured before landing in Dallas. But for Nadine, every second felt like a quiet test, a tightening knot in her chest. Jordan shifted in his seat, rubbing his stomach. "Mom, can I go to the bathroom?" he asked softly, glancing toward the aisle. "Of course, sweetheart," she said, unclipping his belt and straightening his shirt. "Go ahead, I'll be right here." He walked down the narrow aisle, his small frame weaving between legs and trays. Nadine watched him with the sharpened senses of a mother half protective, half anxious. When he reached the first-class lavatory, Karen was there. The attendant's arm shot out, blocking the door before Jordan could reach the handle. "That bathroom is occupied," she said curtly. Jordan glanced back at Nadine. Unsure. Nadine craned her neck and saw clearly the occupied light wasn't on. Her heart thudded. "He can wait right here until it's free," Nadine called gently, trying to keep her voice steady. But Karen leaned closer to Jordan, her voice low but edged like a knife. "These facilities are for premium passengers, the ones who belong here." Jordan's mouth fell open, his lips parted, but no words came. Nadine was already on her feet, ignoring the eyes of the passengers around her. She moved quickly down the aisle, her heels clicking against the floor. "That's my son," she said firmly, standing between Karen and the door. "He has every right to use this lavatory." Karen's smile was brittle, her voice louder now. "Ma'am, please sit down. You're disrupting the service." Nadine felt a flash of heat in her chest. Her hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing how easily this moment could be twisted. "The light says vacant," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "He's waiting politely. There is no disruption except the one you're creating." Murmurs rose around them. A man 2 rows away whispered, "She's right. It's open." Another passenger lifted their phone subtly, beginning to record. Richard Calloway leaned into the aisle, his voice carrying a rehearsed indignation. "This is unbelievable. Some kids just don't know how to behave. We all paid for peace and quiet in this cabin." Jordan's cheeks burned, his eyes darting from the stranger to his mother. He shifted on his feet, as though his very existence in that space had suddenly become a crime. Nadine crouched so she was eye level with her son. "You did nothing wrong," she whispered. "Do you hear me?" "Nothing." Karen crossed her arms. "If you don't return to your seat, I'll have to make a formal report. Assault and interference with crew duties are federal offenses." The words cut like a blade. Nadine knew the power they carried, accusations that could follow them far beyond this plane. Her pulse pounded, but she forced herself to breathe. Luis appeared then, his eyes wide, his tray clattering slightly as he set it on an empty seat. "Karen," he said quickly, his voice nervous, "the bathroom is empty. I just checked." Karen shot him a look that could shatter glass. But it was too late. Passengers were watching now. Phones held higher. The fiction was slipping. Still. Karen didn't move. Instead, she pivoted sharply, pointing a finger at Jordan. He bumped into Mr. Calloway earlier. Nearly knocked him over. Disrespectful from the start. Richard leaned back smugly, adjusting his cufflinks. "That's right. I was practically shoved." Jordan's small voice piped up, trembling. I didn't shove him. I just walked past." Nadine's chest ached at the sound. Her son shouldn't have to defend his very existence in first class. The tension thickened, pressing on every passenger. The hum of the engine seemed louder now, the air heavier. Nadine felt her hands clench, her nails digging into her palms. Her instinct screamed to fight, but her mind reminded her of the cost of losing control. She straightened, looking Karen in the eye. "My son is going to use that restroom. Now." For a moment, time held still. Then, slowly, Karen lowered her arm. She stepped aside with exaggerated reluctance, her lips tight. Jordan darted inside, closing the door quickly. Nadine stood tall, her voice low but firm. "We're not invisible, and we're not leaving." She turned and walked back to her seat, her spine straight, though her insides quivered. She sat down, pulling in a deep breath. Jordan returned moments later, sliding back into his seat. He said nothing, but the way he leaned against her told her everything. He was shaken, confused, hurt. Nadine brushed his hair with her hand, whispering again, "You belong here." But as she whispered it, she wondered how many times she would have to repeat it before the world believed it too. Dinner trays had been cleared, and most of the cabin had settled into a quiet lull. Overhead, the lights dimmed to a soft amber, the kind that encouraged sleep. But Nadine could not rest. Her jaw ached from clenching, her hands from holding too tightly to Jordan's. The memory of Karen's arm barring him from the restroom looped in her mind like a cruel echo. Jordan leaned against her shoulder, his eyes half closed, but Nadine could feel his small body tense every time Karen walked past. Children weren't supposed to feel unsafe just for existing. Nadine's chest tightened. How many times would she have to shield him from moments like this, Karen? Meanwhile, moved through the aisle with a brittle kind of efficiency. Her smile returned for other passengers, polite. Warm even, but always vanished when her eyes landed on Nadine and her son. To the rest of the cabin, she was a seasoned professional. But Nadine had seen the shift, the hostility behind the mask. Richard Calloway had ordered another glass of wine, and his voice carried, slightly slurred now. "You know," he said to no one in particular, though loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "This is what happens when you let standards drop. First class used to mean something." He gestured vaguely in Nadine's direction. "Now it's anyone with the right credit card, I suppose." A few passengers looked away uncomfortably. Others frowned. Jordan's head sank lower, his cheeks hot. Nadine reached for his hand, whispering softly, "Ignore him, baby." But she knew the damage was already sinking in. The turbulence started just as dessert service ended. The plane jolted, a quick dip that sent glasses rattling. Karen's voice came over the intercom, crisp and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, the seatbelt sign is on. Please remain seated." Jordan, startled, clutched Nadine's arm. He had always hated turbulence. Nadine smoothed his hair, whispering reassurance, though her own stomach lurched with each bump. After a few minutes, the turbulence eased. Passengers shifted, exhaled, returned to their screens or books. Jordan squirmed in his seat. "Mom, I need the bathroom again," he whispered, urgency in his voice. Nadine hesitated, her eyes flicking to Karen at the front of the cabin. She hated the thought of another confrontation, but Jordan's discomfort was plain. "Okay," she said gently. "Go. This time, I'll walk with you." Together they stood, moving toward the front. As they reached the aisle, Karen intercepted them, her hand snapping out again like a gate. "Back to your seats," she said sharply. "We're still in turbulence protocol." "The seatbelt sign is off," Nadine replied evenly, nodding toward the overhead panel. "He needs the restroom." "Then he can wait until the economy lavatory is available," Karen snapped, her voice rising. "I won't have more disruptions up here." Nadine's patience thinned. "This is harassment," she said, her voice steady but cold. "You've allowed other children through without question. You're singling out my son." Karen's face flushed. "Ma'am, control yourself. You're dangerously close to interfering with crew duties. Do you want federal charges when we land?" The words were like ice. Nadine felt the ripple through the cabin as passengers turned to look. Jordan's eyes went wide. Fear etched into his young face. "Please," Jordan whispered, tugging at her sleeve. "It's okay. Mom, I can wait." But Nadine's chest ached. She saw the way his shoulders curled in, the way his voice shrank. A child, already learning to make himself smaller so others could feel big. Richard chuckled under his breath, muttering something about discipline. Nadine snapped her head toward him. "You don't speak to my son," she said, her voice sharp as glass. That was when it happened. Jordan shifted past Nadine, stepping closer to the lavatory. His small shoulder brushed Richard's as he squeezed by. It was nothing, an ordinary bump in the tight aisle. But Richard jerked back dramatically, nearly spilling his wine. "He shoved me," Richard barked, his voice rising above the hum of the plane. "This is exactly what I warned you about." Karen seized the moment. "Young man," she said loudly, pointing at Jordan, "that behavior is unacceptable. You need to apologize immediately." "I already said sorry," Jordan whispered, trembling. "Not good enough?" Richard spat. "This boy needs to learn respect." Karen stepped forward, her eyes blazing, her authority swelling with the drama. She reached for Jordan's arm. "You're coming with me to the back of the aircraft until we sort this out." Nadine moved fast, stepping between them. "Don't touch my son." Karen's lips curled. "Ma'am, step aside." The aisle went silent. Dozens of passengers watched. Phones raised now, recording. Nadine's heart thundered. She grabbed Jordan, pulling him close. "You will not lay a hand on him," she said. Karen's composure cracked. Her hand shot out, gripping Jordan's shoulder. He jerked back instinctively, stumbling into Nadine. In the chaos, Karen lost her balance, then shoved forward to steady herself. The motion slammed Jordan sideways into the hard edge of a seat. The crack was audible, a sharp, sickening sound. Jordan screamed, clutching his face. Blood poured from his nose, bright against his brown skin, staining his shirt in seconds. Jordan Nadine cried, dropping to her knees beside him. Her hands fluttered, desperate, pressing napkins against the gush of blood. Her son whimpered in pain, his eyes wide, his small body shaking. Gasps erupted from the cabin. She pushed him. A woman shouted from row 3, "I saw it!" "That's assault on a child," another man yelled. His phone raised higher. Luis dropped his tray and rushed forward with napkins. His face was pale, his voice urgent. "Here, apply pressure." "I'll get the first aid kit." Karen froze, her hands trembling. He attacked me," she stammered weakly, her words hollow. "I was defending myself." "Defending yourself?" Nadine's voice was raw, fierce. She looked up at Karen, her hands still trying to stem the blood. "He's 12 years old." "You broke his nose," Jordan whimpered, his voice muffled through blood. "Mom, I didn't do anything." Nadine's eyes filled with tears, but her voice steadied. "I know, baby. I know." Phones were everywhere now. Passengers shouted, demanding accountability. Richard shrank into his seat, muttering denials. But no one listened. And then, over the chaos, a new voice cut through. Calm, authoritative, commanding. "What in God's name happened to my son?" The cockpit door had opened. A tall figure in uniform stood there, his presence filling the aisle. The gold stripes on his shoulders gleamed under the cabin lights. His face was set like stone, but his eyes sharp, dark, furious, landed on the sight of blood streaming down Jordan's face. The entire cabin fell silent. Karen's mouth fell open. The blood drained from her face. She whispered, almost to herself, Your son." The captain took one step forward. His voice was quiet, but it carried like thunder. "Step away from my child." The moment Marcus Ellington stepped into the cabin, the air shifted. The quiet authority of his presence was undeniable. Passengers straightened in their seats without realizing it, drawn into the gravity of the man who now filled the aisle. His pilot's cap was tucked neatly under one arm, his uniform immaculate, the 4 gold stripes on his shoulders glinting under the cabin lights. But none of that mattered in that instant. What mattered was the fury in his eyes as they landed on his son. Jordan was hunched against his mother, blood streaming through napkins pressed hastily to his face. His small body trembled, his shirt stained red. Nadine's hands shook as she tried to stop the bleeding, her own blouse smeared with crimson. Her eyes, when they met Marcus's, were wet with rage and heartbreak. Marcus dropped to his knees beside them in one fluid motion, his professional mask breaking into the raw panic of a father. "Jordan," he breathed, his voice low, trembling despite himself. He cupped his son's chin gently, careful not to press against the broken nose. "Buddy, it's okay. I'm here now." "Dad," Jordan whispered, his voice thick, barely audible through the swelling and blood. Relief flickered in his eyes, even through the pain. Passengers exchanged shocked looks. A murmur ran through the cabin like a current. The captain was his father. The realization deepened the horror of what they had just witnessed. Phones recorded every second. Marcus turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Karen. His jaw clenched so tightly a muscle jumped along his cheek. His voice, when it came, was low and lethal. "Tell me exactly what you did." Karen swallowed hard, her composure unraveling. "Captain, I didn't know. That is not what I asked." His words were sharp, each syllable clipped. "Did you lay your hands on a child under your care?" "On my child." The cabin was silent except for Jordan's muffled whimpers. Karen stammered, her gaze darting between Marcus and the passengers holding up phones. He was disruptive. He shoved a passenger. "I was following protocol." Protocol, Marcus's voice thundered now, filling the entire cabin. He rose slowly to his full height, his frame towering over her. "Protocol does not involve shoving an 11-year-old into a metal seat and breaking his nose." Passengers muttered agreement, some audibly. "We saw it." A woman from row 3 called out, "You shoved him. He barely brushed that man." "Lies," Richard blurted from his seat, his face flushed with fear and wine. "The boy was aggressive. I felt threatened." Threatened, Nadine's voice was hoarse. But she stood now, her hands still pressed against Jordan's shoulder. By a 12-year-old who said, "Excuse me." Her eyes cut through Richard like a blade. "You lied, and you fed her hatred." Marcus's head snapped toward Richard, his stare unblinking. "You, sit down and stay quiet. Law enforcement will deal with you." Richard sank into his seat, his arrogance evaporating. Marcus turned back to Karen. His voice dropped low again, and that calm tone carried more danger than his roar. "You are relieved of duty, effective immediately. Go to the rear galley. Do not speak to another passenger. Do not move unless escorted." Karen opened her mouth as if to protest, but something in his eyes stopped her cold. She turned stiffly, walking down the aisle toward the back. Passengers whispered as she passed, some glaring openly, others shaking their heads. Luis Martinez, pale and shaken, hurried forward with the first aid kit. "Captain, I'll help," he said quickly, his voice cracking with nerves. He knelt beside Nadine and Jordan, pulling out gauze and antiseptic. Marcus nodded once. "Thank you, Luis." As Luis worked gently, Marcus crouched again, his hand never leaving Jordan's shoulder. "You're brave, son," he whispered. "I know it hurts, but we'll get you fixed up as soon as we land. Just hold on for me a little longer." Jordan nodded weakly, his eyes closing for a moment. Nadine brushed his damp hair back, murmuring softly. Marcus stood, turning to face the cabin. His expression was composed now, the mask of a captain restored, though his eyes still burned. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying with practiced authority, "you have just witnessed an incident that no passenger should ever experience, least of all a child. I assure you this matter will be handled with the utmost seriousness. Law enforcement and medical personnel will meet us at the gate. I thank you for your cooperation in giving your statements when asked." Phones lowered slightly, passengers nodding. Some even applauded softly, not out of cheer, but solidarity. The tension in the air shifted into something else: support for the family, outrage at what had happened. Marcus leaned down to Nadine, his voice low. "Stay with him. I have to return to the cockpit for landing, but I'll coordinate with operations. I won't let this disappear." Nadine met his eyes, reading the fury under his controlled exterior. She squeezed his hand. "We're with you, before leaving." Marcus bent close to Jordan once more. "I'll be right up front, buddy. The second we're on the ground, I'll be with you again." Jordan managed a faint smile through the swelling. "Okay, Dad." Marcus straightened, gave Luis a nod, and turned back toward the cockpit. Every eye followed him as he disappeared behind the reinforced door, the sound of it closing echoing like a promise. In the cabin, the whispers resumed. "I can't believe she did that," someone muttered. "To the captain's own son." Another passenger shook their head. "Doesn't matter if it was his son. No kid should be treated that way." Nadine sat back, her arm wrapped around Jordan, her heart pounding still. The blood on her hands was tacky now, drying against her skin. She glanced at Luis, who was carefully stabilizing Jordan's nose with gauze and ice packs. "Thank you," she whispered. Luis shook his head. "I should have stopped her sooner. I saw it happening from the start." His voice cracked. "I'm sorry. You're helping now," Nadine said softly. "That's what matters." Jordan groaned softly, his face pale. Nadine stroked his hair. "It's okay, sweetheart. We'll be home soon." But even as she said it, she knew nothing would ever be the same after this flight. The world had just shifted, and the turbulence they were facing now wasn't in the air. It was something deeper, something that reached far beyond the walls of the plane. The cabin never returned to calm after Marcus disappeared behind the cockpit door. Though the hum of the engines was steady, an undercurrent of unease filled every corner. Passengers shifted in their seats, whispering to one another, their eyes flicking between Jordan's pale face and the empty aisle where Karen had stood moments before. Nadine sat upright, cradling her son, refusing to let him slump. The cold pack Louis had placed against his nose was slowly dulling the swelling, but the blood-stained napkins piled on the tray table told the true story. She stroked Jordan's hair, whispering soothing words even as her own thoughts swirled. How could one flight, one evening, unravel into this? And yet, she knew it had been building from the moment Karen first looked at them. Louis lingered beside their row, crouched slightly as though unwilling to leave them unprotected. His voice was soft, almost apologetic. "He's stable, for now, ma'am, but when we land, he'll need a full exam, likely a fracture." Nadine nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you, Louis. You've been the only one with decency tonight." He lowered his eyes. "I should have spoken sooner. I kept thinking, if I said something, Karen would turn on me. But watching what she did," his voice faltered. "Silence made me part of it." Nadine studied him. His youth was plain he couldn't have been older than 25. Fear was etched into his features, but so was regret. "Courage doesn't always come first," she said gently. "Sometimes it comes after we see what's at stake. You stepped up when it mattered most." Louis's lips pressed together, as though holding back tears. He nodded and stood, retreating only far enough to give them space, but keeping his eyes fixed on the aisle as though standing guard. Behind them, Richard Calloway shifted uncomfortably. He had tried earlier to sip his wine with his usual arrogance, but the weight of the passengers' stares had silenced him. "Now," he muttered under his breath, his words half slurred. "This is getting blown out of proportion. It was an accident." The woman in row 3 snapped her head around, glaring. "We all saw it. Don't you dare minimize what happened to that child." A ripple of agreement moved through the cabin. Others nodded, some even voicing support aloud. "She pushed him. That boy did nothing wrong. We have it on video." Phones glowed in the dim light, screens filled with the captured assault, evidence that could not be denied. Richard paled, his bravado shrinking. He sank lower into a seat, pulling his jacket tighter around him as though fabric could shield him from judgment. Jordan stirred, opening his eyes again. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice weak but clear. Are they mad at me?" Nadine's heart clenched. She cupped his cheek carefully, avoiding the swollen bridge of his nose. "No, sweetheart. They're mad at what was done to you, and they should be. You've done nothing but be yourself." Jordan's eyes watered, but not just from pain. "It feels like I always do something wrong, even when I don't." Her chest ached at his words. She kissed his temple, holding him tighter. "That's not on you. That's on them. And tonight, the world is watching. They'll see the truth." A chime interrupted, followed by Marcus's voice over the intercom. Calm, steady, professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are beginning our descent into Dallas. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened. Emergency services will meet us at the gate. Thank you for your cooperation." The cabin stilled. His voice was soothing, but Nadine heard the strain beneath it. She knew that tone. It was the balance of authority and fury, of a man carrying the weight of both duty and fatherhood. The descent was smooth, but no one's mind was on the landing. Eyes stayed locked on the Ellington family, on the boy whose innocence had been stained with blood, and on the gaping absence of the flight attendant who had caused it. When the wheels touched down, the thud reverberated like a promise of reckoning. Passengers exhaled collectively, some in relief, others in anticipation of what awaited at the gate. The seatbelt sign blinked off. Immediately, a voice rose from the back Karens, brittle with false composure. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated while we disembark priority passengers." She didn't finish. Marcus's voice cut through, sharper than steel, from the cockpit door. "Karen Holt, you will not address this cabin again. Sit down." Gas rippled through the rows. Karen froze mid-step, her face paling as every passenger's phone lifted toward her. For the first time, she looked small, cornered. Slowly, she retreated to the galley, her shoulders rigid, her mouth a thin, trembling line. Moments later, the plane taxied to the gate. Through the window, flashing lights appeared police vehicles and paramedics waiting on the tarmac. The tension thickened as the door opened and officers boarded, their presence immediate and undeniable. Marcus emerged from the cockpit, his hat now firmly in place, his shoulders squared. He led the officers directly to Nadine and Jordan. His hand touched his son's shoulder gently before addressing the officers. "This is the victim. He needs immediate medical care." One officer nodded, crouching beside Jordan with professional care. The boy winced as they examined his nose, but he stayed brave, clutching Nadine's hand. Another officer turned toward Marcus. "Captain Ellington, can you identify the crew member responsible?" Marcus's eyes flicked to the rear galley. "Karen Holt, senior attendant. She assaulted my son and endangered the safety of this flight." Passengers erupted, some voicing agreement, others offering their videos as proof. Phones waved in the air, clips already queued up. The officers moved down the aisle, finding Karen rigid against the galley wall. Her face was ashen, her hands trembling. "It was a misunderstanding," she whispered, her voice shaking. He was aggressive. You assaulted a child." The officer cut in, snapping handcuffs around her wrists. "You're under arrest for assault and endangerment. You have the right to remain silent." Karen's protest dissolved into panicked sobs as she was led down the aisle. Passengers booed softly, some even clapping as she disappeared out the door. Richard tried to shrink back, but Marcus's voice called him out sharply. And this man, Richard Calloway, was complicit. He provoked, lied, and enabled her abuse. I expect his actions to be included in the investigation. The officer's gaze snapped toward Richard. He stuttered. I didn't," passengers shouted over him. "We heard you. You lied." Check the video, phones rose again, capturing every angle of his guilt. The officer's jaw tightened. "Sir, you'll be escorted for questioning as well." Two deputies hauled him up, ignoring his sputtered protests. His face, once smug, was now pale and drenched with sweat. As the officers cleared the aisle, paramedics gently lifted Jordan onto a stretcher. Nadine walked beside him, never letting go of his hand. Marcus followed, his uniform still immaculate, but his face shadowed by grief and fury. As they disembarked, passengers erupted into applause, not the kind for a safe landing, but for justice, for truth revealed in the harshest light. Phones filmed the captain walking off the aircraft behind his injured son, a tableau that would ripple far beyond the walls of the airport. For Nadine, each step down the jet bridge felt surreal. her heart torn between relief that help had finally come and the raw ache of what her son had endured. For Marcus, every flash of the cameras outside was both a wound and a weapon. They hadn't asked for a stage, but now the world was watching, and in that glare of attention, the Ellingtons knew this was no longer just their story. It had already become something bigger. The airport terminal buzzed with an energy that was sharper than usual, almost electric. By the time the Ellington family stepped off the jet bridge, escorted by paramedics and trailed by police officers, word had already spread. A crowd of travelers waiting at nearby gates craned their necks, some holding up their phones to capture the sight. News traveled fast in airports faster than luggage on a conveyor belt, and the story was already pulsing through social media before Jordan's stretcher even touched the polished tile. Nadine walked close, one hand gripping the stretcher rails though to tether her son to safety. Jordan lay still, the ice pack pressed against his swollen nose, eyes heavy but alert. He clung to her hand, not wanting her to let go. Marcus followed on the other side, his uniform immaculate, but his face tight with fury. He was still Captain Ellington to everyone around him, but Nadine could feel the father in him boiling, aching, barely contained. Every camera flash from bystanders lit up the raw anger in his eyes. Police officers guided them through the crowd. One turned toward Marcus. "Captain, the press has already caught wind. We can get you through a private exit if you'd prefer." Marcus shook his head firmly. "No, let them see. Let the world see exactly what happened to my son tonight." The officer nodded, understanding that this was more than a private wound now. It was a public reckoning. As the paramedics wheeled Jordan toward the waiting ambulance, a voice rang out from the crowd. "We saw the videos. Captain, we stand with you." Others joined in, applause rising, shouts of justice for Jordan echoing through the terminal. Nadine felt her throat tighten. Strangers, complete strangers, were rallying to their side, their outrage spilling over. Jordan turned his head slightly, his eyes flicking toward the sound. "Mom," he whispered, "are they cheering for me?" Nadine bent close, brushing his hair gently. "Yes, baby. They're cheering because they know what happened to you was wrong. They want to make it right." For a moment, a flicker of pride broke through his pain. But it was fragile, and Nadine could see how deeply the hurt had burrowed already. Marcus leaned close, his voice low but fierce. "They won't forget this, son. None of them will." At the ambulance, the paramedics moved quickly, lifting Jordan inside. Nadine climbed in with him, never loosening her grip. Marcus paused at the door, turning back toward the crowd of passengers and reporters now gathering. Cameras pointed at him like spotlights. He removed his cap, his jaw tightening. "My name is Captain Marcus Ellington," he said, his voice carrying across the concourse. "Tonight, my 12-year-old son was assaulted by a senior crew member aboard this airline on a flight I commanded. He bled in front of passengers who paid for comfort, not cruelty. He bled because prejudice was allowed to masquerade as professionalism." His voice cracked slightly, then hardened again. "We will not let this be swept aside. Not for my family, not for anyone's." Applause roared. Reporters shouted questions. Microphones pushed forward. But Marcus stepped into the ambulance, slamming the door shut behind him. Inside, Nadine sat by Jordan's side, pressing her forehead to his hand. Marcus sat across from them, silent, staring at the floor. The hum of the engine filled the space as the ambulance pulled away, lights flashing against the night. Jordan's voice broke the silence. "Dad, are you mad at me?" Marcus's head jerked up, shock flickering across his face. "Mad at you? Never. Why would you even think that Jordan swallowed, his eyes watery? Because if I wasn't there, this wouldn't have happened. If I stayed quiet, if I stayed smaller. His voice trembled. I make trouble without meaning to. Nadine's heart shattered. She squeezed his hand fiercely. No, Jordan, no. You are not trouble. You are joy. You are light. What happened tonight was their shame, not yours. Marcus leaned forward, his voice rough. Son, look at me. Jordan's eyes lifted slowly. Marcus's hands trembled as he gripped his boy's uninjured shoulder. The only mistake you made tonight was believing you had to shrink yourself for anyone. Do you hear me? You never shrink. Not for anyone. Jordan nodded faintly, but Nadine could see the battle still raging in him. The ambulance pulled into the emergency bay, and the doors swung open. Doctors and nurses swarmed, wheeling Jordan inside. Nadine followed, clutching his hand until hospital staff separated them briefly for x-rays. Marcus stood rooted, his fists clenched, watching his son disappear behind swinging doors. Minutes stretched like hours. Nadine sat in the waiting room, her hands wringing a crumpled napkin still stained with Jordan's blood. Marcus paced, his uniform jacket unbuttoned now, his eyes darting to every clock on the wall. Finally, a doctor approached. Mr. and Mrs. Ellington, your son's nose is fractured, but it's a clean break. We've set it, and with time, it will heal properly. He'll have some swelling and pain for the next few days, but there's no permanent damage expected. Nadine sagged with relief, tears streaming silently down her face. Marcus exhaled, his head dropping into his hands for a moment before straightening again. Can we see him? He asked. The doctor smiled gently. Yes. He's resting now, but he'll want you there. They followed into the recovery room. Jordan lay on the bed, a bandage across his nose, his breathing slow but steady. Nadine sat beside him immediately, brushing his hair back with trembling fingers. Marcus stood at the foot of the bed, staring at his son with an expression that blended love, guilt, and fury. Dad, Jordan murmured, his voice hoarse but calm. Did I do okay? Marcus's throat tightened. He stepped forward, taking his son's hand. You did better than okay. You showed the world who you are. Brave. Strong. My son. Jordan's eyes closed, a small smile flickering across his lips as sleep pulled him under. Silence filled the room, broken only by the steady beep of monitors. Nadine looked at Marcus, her voice low. This can't just be about us. Marcus, if this happened to Jordan, it's happening to other children, to other families who don't have cameras or power on their side. Marcus nodded slowly, his jaw set. Then we make sure it doesn't keep happening. We make sure his pain changes something. He turned toward the window, the city lights glittering beyond. His reflection stared back at him, uniform rumpled, shoulders heavy, but eyes burning with resolve. In that moment, Marcus Ellington knew this night wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Morning sunlight spilled through the blinds of the hospital room, soft and golden, a stark contrast to the heaviness in the Ellingtons' hearts. Jordan stirred beneath the crisp sheets, his face swollen but peaceful as he slept. Nadine sat close by, exhaustion etched into the lines of her face, her hand never leaving her son's. She had dozed in fits, her body refusing true rest, haunted by flashes of the night before the blood, the gas, the shove that had changed everything. Marcus stood by the window, his uniform jacket draped over a chair, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He hadn't closed his eyes all night. Instead, He had fielded calls first from airline executives, then from attorneys, then from reporters clamoring for a statement. His phone buzzed again, vibrating against the chair. He glanced at it, jaw tightening. Another call from the airline's crisis management team. He let it ring. Nadine's voice broke the silence. They want this to go away quietly. Marcus turned, meeting her gaze. Her words weren't a question. She knew. They'll offer apologies, settlements, maybe a press release if they can spin it right. His tone was flat, laced with bitterness. But they don't want accountability. They don't want change. They want silence. Nadine looked at their son, her eyes soft. Jordan doesn't need silence. He needs the world to know. The door creaked open. Luis Martinez stepped in hesitantly, holding a paper bag. His uniform was gone, replaced by plain clothes that somehow made him look even younger. He offered a nervous smile. I brought breakfast from the diner across the street. Pancakes. Thought Jordan might want them when he wakes up. Nadine's lips curved faintly. That's kind of you. Luis, thank you. He shifted on his feet, guilt shadowing his face. I couldn't sleep last night. I kept replaying it, every second. I should have stepped in sooner. His voice cracked. I let fear keep me quiet. Marcus studied him for a long moment. The young man's hands trembled as he set the bag on the counter. Finally, Marcus spoke. Fear is how injustice survives. But courage doesn't come from never being afraid. It comes from deciding fear won't own you. You chose courage when it counted. Luis swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. If there's anything I can do now, anything to make this right, I'll do it. Marcus nodded. You may get that chance. This isn't staying in the dark. As if summoned by his words, the television in the corner flickered on with the morning news. The anchor's voice was calm, but the footage rolling behind her was not. A shaky cell phone video filled the screen. Karen shoving Jordan, his cry of pain. Nadine's frantic hands. Marcus's voice thundering through the cabin. The caption read, Flight attendant assaults boy on flight. Commanded by his father. Video goes viral. Nadine gasped softly, even expecting it. Seeing it broadcast across the nation was different. Jordan's face, his pain, his innocence now frozen on screens for millions to see. Luis muttered, It's everywhere. The anchor continued. The airline has issued a brief statement promising full cooperation with authorities. The flight attendant, identified as Karen Holt, was taken into custody last night. The passenger who corroborated her claims, Richard Calloway, is also under investigation. Outrage has spread online under the hashtag #JusticeForJordan, which has been used over 2 million times since midnight. Marcus's eyes narrowed. His son's trauma was now a trending topic. It made his skin crawl. But he also knew the truth. Attention was leverage. If the world cared, the airline couldn't bury this. The door opened again, and a new figure entered, a tall woman in a sharp navy suit, her expression both stern and compassionate. She extended her hand. Captain Ellington, Mrs. Ellington, my name is Angela Brooks. I represent a coalition of civil rights attorneys. We'd like to offer our support. Marcus shook her hand firmly. You've seen the footage. Everyone has, Angela said. But we don't want this to be just about one family. This is systemic. Bias in service industries and transportation. This is the moment to force change. She glanced at Jordan, her expression softening. And your son. He's become a symbol. Nadine's chest tightened. He's just a boy. Angela nodded. I know. And that's why this resonates. People see him and think of their own children. That fear, that helplessness, it's universal. But so is the demand for dignity. Marcus's jaw set. What do you propose? Angela laid a folder on the table. A civil suit against the airline? Not just for damages, but for reform, mandatory bias training, independent oversight, a passenger protection protocol. We can push for something bigger than apologies. Nadine looked at Marcus, then back at Jordan. Will it drag him through more pain? It won't be easy, Angela admitted, but silence ensures it happens again to someone else's child. Marcus exhaled, his decision already made. Then we don't stay silent. At that moment, Jordan stirred, his eyes fluttering open. Mom, he mumbled. Nadine was at his side instantly, smoothing his hair. I'm here, baby. He glanced at the pancakes Louise had set down, a small smile tugging at his lips. Are those the giant ones? Louis grinned through his nerves. Extra syrup, too. Jordan chuckled softly, wincing at the pain. For a moment, normalcy returned, fragile but real. Nadine kissed his forehead, whispering, You're so strong. Marcus stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on his son's arm. Jordan, people are listening to what happened to you. And because of you, we might be able to make flying safer for other kids, too. How do you feel about that? Jordan blinked, surprised. Me? But I didn't do anything. You told the truth, Marcus said softly. And sometimes that's the bravest thing of all. The boy's eyes watered. But this time it wasn't just from pain. Then, I want them to listen. Marcus and Nadine exchanged a look, one of sorrow, pride, and resolve. Their son's voice had been shaken last night, but it wasn't broken. The news anchor's voice echoed again from the television, reporting that airline stocks had fallen sharply overnight, pressure mounting for executives to respond. Nadine watched the footage, Jordan's bloodied face looping across the screen, and whispered under her breath, This is bigger than us now. Marcus squeezed her hand. Then let's make sure it counts. By the following afternoon, the Ellington family's world had shifted again. Jordan remained in the hospital for observation, his bandaged nose a constant reminder of what had unfolded. But outside those hospital walls, the story had ignited into something larger than any of them could have imagined. Nadine sat by the window with her laptop open, the glow of the screen illuminating her tired face. The hashtag, Justice for Jordan, dominated every platform. Clips of the incident had been shared millions of times. Strangers had written messages of support. Parents across the country posting pictures of their own children flying, their captions filled with both fear and solidarity. Marcus entered the room, still in the clothes he had worn the day before, though now his tie was gone, his collar open. He carried 2 cups of coffee, setting one in front of Nadine. His jaw was tight, but his eyes softened when they fell on her. Any news? She asked quietly. He nodded. The airline board convened an emergency meeting this morning. They've suspended Holt indefinitely and stripped Calloway of his elite status. They're promising a comprehensive review of service practices. His voice dripped with skepticism. It's lip service. Damage control. Nadine frowned, glancing at Jordan, who was asleep again, his breathing even. Do they know it's not enough? They will, Marcus said, because the world isn't letting go. As if on cue, the television flickered with a live broadcast. A spokesperson from the airline stood stiffly behind a podium, delivering carefully chosen words. We are deeply saddened by the events on Flight 227. Our hearts go out to the Ellington family. We are cooperating fully with law enforcement and reviewing our internal policies. Nadine closed the laptop with a snap. Hearts go out. They broke our son's face, And they talk like it was bad weather, like some inconvenience. Marcus sipped his coffee, silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Angela Brooks called again. She wants us at a press conference tonight. She says the public needs to hear from us directly." Nadine's eyes widened. "Tonight, Marcus. Jordan's barely." She said we don't have to put him in front of cameras, just us, as his parents, as witnesses. His eyes hardened. "If we don't speak, they'll control the story." A stir at the door broke their conversation. Luis Martinez stepped in, holding a folder and looking far less nervous than before. His clothes were still simple, but there was determination in his eyes. "I brought something," he said, setting the folder on the table. Marcus looked at him warily. "What is it?" "Copies of internal crew logs." Luis replied. "Karen kept notes, complaints she filed about difficult passengers. I pulled them before they locked me out of the system. You need to see how often she targeted families of color. How many times her reports didn't line up with passenger complaints. She wasn't just having a bad night. This was a pattern." Nadine opened the folder, her stomach turning as she scanned the notes. Words like non-compliant, aggressive, and suspicious appeared again and again, always next to names that echoed with heritage, with skin deeper than white. Luis continued, his voice tight, and the airline knew. They ignored it. They protected her because her record of service was long and her ratings from wealthy passengers were good. She made the wrong people comfortable, so they let her keep flying. Marcus's fists clenched on the edge of the bed. "You realize what you've done, Luis? They'll come after you for leaking this." Luis swallowed, but his chin lifted. "I don't care. I watched that boy bleed. I won't be complicit anymore." For the first time, Marcus's expression softened toward him. "Then you're braver than most." That evening, cameras flashed as Marcus and Nadine stepped into a crowded press room. The atmosphere was electric, reporters shouting questions even before they reached the podium. Angela Brooks stood behind them, her presence steady, guiding. Marcus adjusted the microphone, his voice firm, resonant. "We are here not as symbols, not as headlines, but as parents. Parents whose son was assaulted on a flight where he should have been safe. Parents who watch the people sworn to care for him treat him as less than human." He paused, the silence stretching, every lens fixed on him. "This is not just about our child. This is about every passenger who has been treated with suspicion because of the color of their skin. Every family told to shrink themselves so others could feel bigger." Nadine stepped forward, her voice softer but no less powerful. "Our son is 12. He should be worried about homework and basketball games, not learning that even in first class. His presence can be treated as a threat. So we will not let his pain be minimized. We will not let this be swept aside." The room erupted in questions, cameras flashing like lightning, but their words had landed, clear and sharp, carried across every network. That night, Jordan watched from his hospital bed as the clip of his parents' speech replayed on the news. He looked at Nadine, who sat beside him, and whispered. They listened. She brushed his hair gently, smiling through her tears. "Yes, baby, they're listening." Marcus stood at the window again, the city lights stretching beyond. He felt the weight of it, the attention, the responsibility. But he also felt something else growing momentum. For the first time since the flight, he allowed himself to believe that this storm might lead to change. The following days were a whirlwind. The Ellingtons' phones buzzed constantly calls from journalists, community leaders, even strangers who wanted to thank them for speaking out. Marcus tried to shield Nadine and Jordan from the worst of it, but even in the hospital, they couldn't escape the noise. Jordan's face, bruised but healing, was everywhere. On the third morning after the incident, Marcus received a call from Senator Elaine Porter, a longtime advocate for transportation equity. Her voice was crisp, carrying urgency. "Mr. Ellington, I watched your press conference. What happened to your son is horrifying, but it could become the turning point we've needed. I want you to testify before the Senate Committee on Civil Rights and Transportation." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the request. He had fought for equity in boardrooms, across negotiating tables, but the thought of bringing his family's trauma to the national stage cut deeper. "Senator, my priority is my son's healing. He's 12, and that's why it matters," Porter pressed gently. "Because people need to understand this isn't abstract. It's not policy language. It's children, families, real lives." That night, Marcus shared the call with Nadine. She listened quietly, her hand stroking Jordan's hair as he dozed beside her. After a long silence, she said, "You've spent your whole career fighting for dignity in business. Maybe this is where you fight for it in the air." Marcus hesitated, then nodded slowly. "If it helps make sure no other kid bleeds because of ignorance, then yes, I'll do it." Meanwhile, the airline scrambled to contain the crisis. Leaked memos revealed that executives had known about Karen Holt's history of complaints. They had chosen to protect her, worried about lawsuits from elite customers who enjoyed her favoritism. Richard Calloway's name surfaced again, tied to campaign donations and backroom favors. Luis Martinez became an unlikely public figure. His testimony, combined with the logs he provided, painted a damning picture. Reporters sought him out, calling him the conscience of the cabin. At first nervous, Luis grew steadier each time he spoke. "I stayed quiet too long," he admitted on live television. "But silence is complicity. I won't stay quiet again." The public latched onto his words. Alongside Dacium Justice for Jordan, a second hashtag began to spread. No more silence. Flight crews from other airlines began sharing anonymous stories of racial bias, of passengers removed for no reason other than skin tone or accent. What had started as a single boy's broken nose had become a rallying cry. When the Senate hearing day arrived, Washington, D.C., was buzzing. Cameras lined the marble steps, reporters craning for sound bites. Inside the committee chamber, Marcus sat at the witness table, Nadine in the front row, Jordan at home with his grandmother. He adjusted the microphone, heart pounding but gaze steady. "Good morning. My name is Marcus Ellington. I am the father of Jordan Ellington, a 12-year-old boy who was assaulted on a flight by a senior flight attendant." His voice caught slightly, but he pressed on. "I'm also a CEO, a man who has negotiated billion-dollar contracts. But on that plane, none of that mattered. To them, my son was just a black child in the wrong seat." Gas rippled through the room, but Marcus didn't pause. He recounted every detail: the dismissive glances, the double standards, the final violent shove. He described watching blood soak his son's shirt while strangers argued about whether his pain was real. He spoke of systemic patterns, of Karen Holt's history, of the corporate culture that had enabled her. "This isn't about one employee," Marcus said firmly. "It's about the system that gave her the power to treat my son as less than human. It's about every passenger told they don't belong. And unless we change that system, Jordan won't be the last child to pay the price." The committee chair, Senator Porter, leaned forward. "Mr. Ellington, what do you want to see changed?" Marcus exhaled slowly, the words heavy with conviction. "Mandatory bias training for all crew. independent oversight of complaints, whistleblower protections for employees who speak up, and consequences, real consequences for those who let prejudice fly at 30,000 feet. The room erupted in applause, though the gavel quickly called it back to order. But the message had landed. The hearing was broadcast live, clips spreading within hours. Parents, pilots, attendants, and travelers across the country shared Marcus's words. "Unless we change the system, my son won't be the last." Back in their hotel room, Nadine hugged him tightly. "You did it?" she whispered. "No," Marcus said, looking out at the Capitol dome glowing against the night sky. "We started it." In the weeks that followed, ripple effects spread. The airline announced sweeping reforms, not just suspending Holt, but firing several executives who had shielded her. They pledged $50 million to create a diversity and equity program, overseen by an independent council. More importantly, they launched the Jordan Ellington Scholarship for aspiring minority pilots and flight crew, ensuring opportunities for the very kids once sidelined. At school, Jordan struggled at first with the attention. Some kids called him a hero. Others whispered unkindly about fame. But gradually, with therapy, with the love of his parents, he grew steadier. One afternoon, he told Nadine, "I still want to fly. Mom, not as a passenger, as the one in the cockpit, like Dad." Her eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "Then you will, sweetheart, and you'll soar higher than any of them imagined." By the time spring came, Marcus had been invited to keynote an aviation summit. As he stood before hundreds of industry leaders, he thought of that night on the plane, of blood and panic and betrayal, but he also thought of resilience, Jordan's courage, Nadine's strength, Luis's bravery, Angela's guidance. "Airplanes are meant to bring people together," Marcus said, "to collapse distance, to connect lives. But prejudice builds walls even at 30,000 feet. It's time we tear them down." The audience rose in a standing ovation, and in that moment, Marcus knew turbulence had rocked their lives, but they were already climbing again, heading toward clearer skies. Spring eased into summer, and with it, the bruises on Jordan's face faded until only faint shadows remained. But the real healing, the invisible wounds, took longer. Nights still brought sudden wake-ups, his body tense, the memory of the shove vivid in his dreams. Nadine would sit by his bed, stroking his hair until his breathing evened out again, whispering, "You're safe now, baby. You're safe." Marcus carried his own scars differently. On the outside, he was the same composed captain, the same CEO who negotiated without flinching. But inside, he felt every headline, every interview, every reminder of how quickly dignity could be stripped away. He had learned to hide his anger behind calm words, but Nadine saw the strain in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched too tightly around coffee mugs. Yet amidst the pain, something else had bloomed. Across the nation, airlines had begun to adopt reforms inspired by the Ellingtons' fight. Bias training became standard. Whistleblower hotlines appeared, and passengers began sharing their stories more freely. Schools invited Marcus and Nadine to speak to parents and students about resilience. And when Marcus stood in front of a crowd, telling their story, he felt the burden ease just slightly, because their hurt was sparking something bigger. One bright June afternoon, Jordan stood in their backyard, holding a small model plane in his hands. He tilted it against the wind, watching it catch the air. "Dad," he called, "do you think I'll really fly one day?" Marcus, who had been fixing the old swing set, looked up. "I don't think, son. I know. You've already survived turbulence most people couldn't imagine. The sky is waiting for you." Jordan's smile stretched wide. He launched the model, and it soared higher than either of them expected before landing softly in the grass. Nadine clapped from the porch, her laughter ringing like music. For a fleeting moment, it felt like joy had finally reclaimed its rightful place. Weeks later, they attended the official launch of the Jordan Ellington Scholarship Fund. The ballroom buzzed with energy, filled with aspiring young pilots, attendants, and engineers, many of them children of color, who once believed the industry had no room for them. Nadine sat with Jordan at the front, holding his hand as speaker after speaker praised his courage. When Marcus took the stage, he didn't read from the notes Angela had prepared. Instead, he spoke from his heart. This scholarship isn't about a broken nose. It's about the truth that dignity should never be negotiable. Not at 30,000 feet. Not anywhere. My son reminded us that courage sometimes looks like a 12-year-old telling the world, "I matter." And because he mattered, so will every young person here tonight. Jordan ducked his head, embarrassed by the applause. But Nadine leaned close. "You see, you've already changed the sky." That evening, after the event, Angela Brooks approached them. "I've seen many families break under this kind of pressure," she admitted. "But your strength gave others permission to stand. You didn't just change a policy, you started a movement." Marcus shook her hand, gratitude in his eyes. "We couldn't have done it without you. Without Luis. Without everyone who decided silence wasn't an option." As if on cue, Luis himself appeared, looking more confident than ever. He had left the airline and was now training as a counselor for whistleblowers. He hugged Nadine warmly and high-fived Jordan, who grinned. "I kept my promise." Luis said, "No more silence." The family left the ballroom late that night, their hearts lighter, driving home. Jordan rested his head against the window, his voice soft but sure. "Dad, when I grow up, I don't just want to fly planes. I want to make sure no kid ever feels small up there. Like it's their sky, too." Marcus's throat tightened. He reached back, squeezing his son's hand. "That's the kind of captain the world needs." Nadine smiled, watching the city lights blur past. For the first time in months, she felt hope settle into her bones, steady and warm. Their journey had been born in pain, but it was leading them somewhere brighter. On a quiet Sunday morning not long after, Marcus and Jordan stood together on the tarmac of a small airfield. Marcus had arranged for a short lesson with a flight instructor friend. As the small plane hummed to life, Jordan's eyes widened, excitement replacing fear. Marcus placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Ready?" Jordan grinned. "More than ready." As the aircraft lifted off, Nadine waved from the ground, her heart swelling. The plane climbed higher, sunlight catching its wings. Jordan's laughter crackled through the headset, pure and unbroken. And in that moment, the Ellingtons knew they had faced turbulence. But now they were soaring, not because the skies were suddenly free of storms, but because they had learned they could weather them together. The story refused to fade. Weeks turned into months. And yet, whenever Marcus walked into an airport, whispers followed him. Nadine noticed it too, how strangers recognized them, how Jordan's name had become shorthand for a larger conversation. Some days, the attention felt like armor, proof that people cared. Other days, it was exhausting, a reminder that their private pain had become public property. One evening, while Nadine prepared dinner, Jordan sat at the kitchen table scrolling on his tablet, his brow furrowed. "Mom," he said quietly, "someone just posted that I'm lying. That Dad probably made it all up to get money." His voice trembled, the wound reopening. Nadine wiped her hands quickly, moving to his side. She crouched down, cupping his chin. "Baby, people will say cruel things when they're afraid of truth, but we know what happened. The world saw it, and no amount of denial will erase that." Marcus entered just then, carrying files from his office. He overheard, his face tightening. "Let me see that." He read the comment, a smear written by an anonymous account. His instinct was to rage, but instead he closed the tablet gently. He looked at his son. "You don't fight every shadow. Jordan, you keep flying toward the light. That's what scares them most, that you'll rise higher than their hate." Jordan studied his father's face, then nodded. "Okay, I'll try." Later that week, Marcus attended a meeting with other CEOs in the aviation industry. He stood in a glass-walled boardroom overlooking the city, addressing leaders who were used to controlling narratives. He told them bluntly, "This isn't just about one airline. This is about all of you. If you don't change, you'll face more Jordans. And the next family might not stop at hearings. They might dismantle you completely." There was resistance grumbling about costs, about reputations, but there was also unease. Marcus left knowing seeds had been planted. Change would not be instant, but it had been forced into motion. At home, Nadine focused on creating normalcy for Jordan. She scheduled therapy, encouraged basketball practice, and reminded him to just be 12. But she also saw how he had grown older inside, how he carried questions too big for his age. One night, as she tucked him in, he asked, "Mom, why do some people see me as dangerous just because I'm black?" Her throat tightened, but she answered honestly, "Because fear and ignorance are powerful. Sweetheart, but so is truth, and so is love. You don't change yourself to fit their fear. You help the world learn better." Jordan's eyes searched hers, like we're doing now. She kissed his forehead, exactly like that. Meanwhile, Luis Martinez's journey unfolded publicly. He gave an interview about whistleblowing, admitting his fears, his regrets, and his decision to act anyway. His vulnerability struck a chord. Soon, he was invited to join a nonprofit dedicated to protecting aviation workers who spoke against misconduct. He called Marcus late one evening to thank him. "You gave me courage," Luis said. Marcus shook his head. "No, Luis, you gave it to yourself. I just happened to see it." Their bond became another thread in the larger movement. The narrative was no longer just about a boy with a broken nose. It was about employees reclaiming their voices, parents demanding accountability, passengers insisting on dignity. Then came the invitation Marcus hadn't expected, a TED Talk. The organizers wanted him to share not just the story, but the lessons. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't a performer, but Nadine encouraged him. "You've carried this story as a burden. Maybe it's time to carry it as a torch." On the day of the talk, the stage lights bathed him in warmth. He looked out at the audience faces of all colors, ages, stories. He began quietly, with the memory of his son's cry. "There are sounds you never forget, the crack of bone, the silence of disbelief, the heartbeat of a child who wonders if his pain matters." He spoke of dignity, of systemic change, of courage in the face of silence. His words wove through the auditorium, tender and fierce. He ended with a vision. "One day, I want my son to step on a plane and be seen not as a risk, not as a profile, but simply as a passenger. Until then, we fly together through the turbulence, building clearer skies." The audience rose to their feet, the applause thunderous. Nadine, watching from the wings, felt tears spill down her cheeks. That night, as they drove home, Jordan leaned forward from the back seat. "Dad, you sounded like a captain, not just of a plane, but of everyone." Marcus's heart swelled. He reached back, squeezing his son's hand. "That's because sometimes life calls you to steer through storms you didn't choose. But if you keep steady, you can get everyone through." The family's story did not end neatly. There were still critics, still trolls, still scars. But there was also hope, stitched into every speech, every policy, every child who believed they too could claim the skies. For the Ellingtons, healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about transforming it. They had walked through turbulence and come out with wings stronger than before. And as planes soared overhead, Jordan would often look up, eyes bright, whispering, "Someday, that will be me." And Marcus and Nadine knew he would not just fly. He would soar, carrying with him the weight of pain turned into power. A story that had become more than theirs, a movement that refused to land. By autumn, the rhythm of life had started to steady for the Ellingtons. The headlines had shifted to other stories, but the ripples from that night in the sky were still spreading across the country. Airlines rolled out new safety and dignity protocols. Advocacy groups kept pressing for oversight, and parents wrote letters to Marcus and Nadine, thanking them for refusing to stay silent. The movement had grown beyond them, and in a strange way, that gave them room to breathe. Jordan had returned to school with cautious steps. The first weeks were hard. Classmates stared at him differently. Teachers treated him with extra care, and sometimes whispers followed him down the hallway. But slowly, life resumed its familiar texture. He played basketball again, laughed with his friends, and even volunteered to present in front of the class about aviation, proudly sharing what his dad did for a living. When he finished, his classmates applauded. Jordan smiled shyly, but inside, something settled his story no longer belonged only to pain. Nadine found herself reflecting often on how their lives had shifted. At the grocery store, people would stop her, thanking her for being strong. She accepted their words graciously, but at home, in the quiet, she admitted to Marcus that strength had felt less like a choice and more like survival. "I didn't know I could do this," she whispered one night as they sat on the porch. Marcus reached over, intertwining his fingers with hers. "You didn't have to know. You just had to be who you've always been." For Marcus, the journey was more complicated. He had become a reluctant spokesperson for reform, speaking at summits and meetings, consulted by policymakers. He carried the role with dignity. But there were nights when he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, questioning whether he had failed Jordan in the first place. Nadine sensed those nights, even when he didn't speak, and reminded him gently, "You didn't fail him. You fought for him, and you keep fighting." One chilly morning in October, Marcus received an invitation that stirred both pride and apprehension. The President's Advisory Council on Transportation Equity wanted him to join as a permanent member. It was a role that would require time, travel, and exposure. He shared the news with Nadine over breakfast, expecting hesitation. Instead, she smiled softly. "Maybe this is how we make sure what happened to Jordan doesn't happen again." Jordan, eating his cereal at the table, looked up curiously. "Does that mean you'll be gone more?" "Sometimes," Marcus admitted. "But it also means I'll be helping to change things, so you and kids like you can feel safe when you fly." Jordan thought for a moment, then nodded. "Then you should do it. But promise you won't miss my games," Marcus chuckled, ruffling his hair. Not a chance. Meanwhile, the criminal proceedings against Karen Holt and Richard Calloway unfolded. Holt faced charges of assault and endangerment. Calloway was indicted for obstruction and conspiracy after investigators uncovered how he had pressured the airline to ignore complaints. The courtroom scenes were splashed across the news, but Marcus and Nadine chose not to attend most hearings. They wanted to protect Jordan from reliving the trauma. Still, on the day of Holt's sentencing, Marcus sat in the back of the courtroom, silent and steady. When the judge pronounced her guilty, sentencing her to time served and mandatory rehabilitation programs, Holt glanced back briefly, her eyes meeting his. Marcus didn't feel triumph, only a deep, weary finality. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for his reaction. He simply said, "Justice is not revenge. It's accountability. And now it's time to build something better." Luis Martinez stood beside him that day, his voice louder than before. What happened was a wake-up call for every flight attendant, every crew member. We can't let bias fly anymore. Not on our watch. His words were carried across evening broadcasts, his face now recognizable as someone who had chosen truth over silence. At home that night, Marcus told Nadine about the sentencing. She listened, then asked softly, "Do you feel lighter?" He thought for a moment. Not lighter, but clearer, like the storms moved on. But the clouds remind you it was there. Winter came, and with it, a new chapter for Jordan. On his 13th birthday, Marcus surprised him with a short flight lesson. This time not just riding along, but actually taking the yoke under supervision. Jordan's eyes sparkled as the small aircraft lifted into the crisp sky. His hands trembled at first, but steadied with his father's calm voice guiding him. "Feel the air," Marcus instructed. "Don't fight it. Work with it." Jordan grinned, his confidence blooming. "I feel it. Dad. On the ground." Nadine watched from the hangar, tears streaming freely. She saw not just a boy flying, but a boy reclaiming the sky that had once been stained by cruelty. That night, as they gathered around the dinner table, Nadine raised her glass. To Jordan, to healing, to clearer skies ahead. They clinked glasses, laughter filling the room. For the first time in a long while, it wasn't weighed down by grief or anger. It was light, genuine, whole. Later, as Marcus tucked Jordan into bed, his son asked, "Dad, do you think people will forget what happened?" Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, choosing his words carefully. Some might, but forgetting isn't the same as healing. And healing doesn't mean erasing. It means carrying the story in a way that makes us stronger. Jordan nodded thoughtfully. "Then I want to carry it, not as something bad, but as something that helps me fly." Marcus kissed his forehead, heart swelling. "Then you already have wings, son." As the house grew quiet and the world outside hushed under winter stars, Marcus and Nadine lay awake for a while, holding hands. They knew storms would come again, life guaranteed it. But they also knew their family had faced one of the fiercest and emerged not broken, but transformed. For the Ellingtons, clearer horizons weren't about perfection. They were about resilience, about love that refused to bow, about skies made wide open by courage. And high above, planes crossed the night sky, silent promises of journeys still to come. By the following spring, the Ellingtons' life had settled into a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. Jordan had grown taller, his voice beginning to shift. And though the memory of that night still lingered, it no longer defined him. Instead, it became a chapter in a larger story, one about resilience, family, and change. The family sat together one Saturday morning, the smell of Nadine's pancakes filling the kitchen. Jordan, now 13, eagerly recounted how his science teacher had asked him to give a presentation on aviation technology. I told her about lift and drag and how Dad always says flying is about balance, not control. She said I sounded like I was already in training. His grin was wide, his eyes bright. Marcus chuckled, sipping his coffee. She's not wrong. You've already got the heart of a pilot. Nadine reached across the table, squeezing her son's hand, and the courage of one. Later that week, the family attended a ceremony in Washington, D.C., where the Jordan Ellington Scholarship Fund awarded its first class of recipients. 10 young students, diverse, ambitious, hopeful, stood on stage, each given the chance to pursue careers in aviation. Their faces reflected dreams once thought out of reach. As Marcus addressed the audience, he paused to glance at Jordan sitting proudly in the front row. When our son was hurt, we thought it might break us, but instead, it opened a door that leads here, to these young people who will carry the future of flight. This scholarship isn't just about money, it's about possibility, and it belongs to every child who was ever told they didn't belong in the sky. The applause was thunderous. Nadine wiped tears from her cheeks, her heart swelling with pride, not only for her husband's words, but for the quiet strength their family had cultivated. After the ceremony, one of the recipients, a young woman named Aaliyah, approached Jordan shyly. "You're the reason I'm here," she said. "When I saw what happened to you, I thought, if he can go through that and still dream about flying, maybe I can too." Jordan's cheeks flushed, but he smiled. "Then you're gonna fly higher than me. In that exchange..." Nadine saw the ripple effect of their pain, how it had transformed into someone else's hope. Meanwhile, Marcus's role on the President's Advisory Council deepened. He traveled often, speaking to lawmakers, meeting with airline executives, pushing relentlessly for reforms. Each time, he carried Jordan's story as a reminder that policies were not abstract, they were lifelines. His presence in those rooms carried weight not because he was a CEO, but because he was a father. One evening, returning from a trip, Marcus sat with Nadine on the porch, the hum of summer cicadas filling the air. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough," he admitted. "There are still delays, still excuses, still people trying to water it all down." Nadine leaned against him. "Change isn't a sprint, Marcus. It's a long flight, and you're the one steadying the controls." Her words anchored him, as they always had. Luis Martinez had also found his place. Now working as a full-time advocate for aviation workers, he traveled the country training crews on recognizing and confronting bias. He became a mentor for younger attendants, his story reminding them that silence was not an option. He visited the Ellingtons often, becoming almost like an uncle to Jordan. During one visit, Luis brought a framed photo of himself standing with a group of new flight attendants he had trained. "They asked me who gave me the courage to speak up," he told Jordan, "and I told them it was a boy with a broken nose who showed me that silence hurts more than the truth." Jordan stared at the photo, then hugged him fiercely. "You didn't let me down," he whispered. In those moments, Nadine saw how healing came not from forgetting, but from building new connections, new bonds of trust. The story also found its way into classrooms. Teachers used it as a case study in discussions about justice and ethics. One evening, Jordan showed his parents a textbook draft sent by a friend of a teacher, a chapter on systemic bias in travel, with his story as an example. Mom, Dad, they're teaching about me." His tone was both proud and hesitant, unsure of what it meant to live as a lesson. Marcus knelt beside him. "It's not just about you, son. It's about what you represent, that dignity is worth fighting for, that no child should have to carry what you carried. You're not just a story. You're a beacon." As summer drew to a close, the family traveled together for the first time since the incident. Boarding the plane was not easy. Jordan's steps slowed as they approached the gate, his hand gripping Nadine's tightly. But the crew greeted them warmly, aware of who they were, treating Jordan with a respect that was both genuine and careful. When the plane lifted into the sky, Jordan pressed his face to the window. Watching the clouds drift below, he whispered, "It feels different this time." Nadine leaned close. "Because this time, you know the sky belongs to you." Marcus, sitting across the aisle, smiled softly. He saw not just his son, but the countless children who would one day board planes without fear, without suspicion. He thought of every speech, every late-night call, every sacrifice, and knew it was worth it. When they landed, applause filled the cabin, not for turbulence survived, but for the Ellingtons. Passengers clapped, recognizing the family that had turned pain into progress. Jordan looked around, surprised, then grinned wide. That night, as they settled into their hotel room, Nadine journaled quietly by the window. She wrote of storms weathered, of skies reclaimed, of a boy who had grown stronger than prejudice. And as she closed the book, she whispered a prayer of gratitude not for the pain, but for the strength it had revealed. For the Ellingtons, the journey would always carry scars, but those scars had become maps, guiding them toward clearer horizons. Their story had begun with turbulence, but it now pointed toward a sky wide open with promise. And as Jordan drifted to sleep, dreaming of cockpits and clear skies, Marcus and Nadine knew their legacy was already in motion, not just for their son, but for every child who would follow. Wings unbroken, dreams unbound. The following winter brought a stillness that felt almost foreign after so many months of noise. Snow blanketed their neighborhood in soft layers, muffling the world outside. For the first time in nearly a year, the Ellingtons were able to wake up without a phone buzzing at dawn, without reporters camped at the end of the street, without crisis looming. Jordan sat by the living room window, watching flakes fall. He was taller now, his shoulders beginning to broaden, but his eyes still carried that spark of curiosity that had defined him long before the incident. In his hands, he held a notebook filled with sketches of airplanes' blueprints in pencil, with notes scrawled in the margins. Nadine walked over, holding 2 mugs of cocoa. She glanced at the pages and smiled. "Designing your own fleet now?" Jordan grinned sheepishly. "Maybe. I was thinking, what if there were planes where every kid got a window seat, no matter how full it was?" Her laughter filled the room, light and warm. "That sounds like the kind of airline I'd want to fly." Marcus entered just then, carrying in logs for the fire. He looked at his son's sketches, nodding with approval. "You've got vision. Jordan, don't lose that. Every innovation starts as someone's doodle in a notebook." As the fire crackled, they sat together in the glow. It was a moment of rare calm, one they all cherished. But beyond their walls, the world had not forgotten. Marcus's testimony and advocacy had left a mark that continued to ripple outward. Policies were being debated in Congress, inspired by what was now called the Ellington Protocols, a set of guidelines to ensure accountability in air travel. And though bureaucracy was slow, the very fact that these conversations were happening was itself historic. One afternoon, Angela Brooks visited the house. She carried with her stacks of papers, but her smile was genuine. "I came to share some news," she said as she settled at the kitchen table. "The Senate is preparing to vote on the Transportation Equity and Accountability Act next month. If it passes, it will enshrine oversight, whistleblower protections, and passenger rights into federal law." Nadine's breath caught. "All because of—" Us Angela shook her head. "All because of Jordan. Because a boy spoke truth with his broken body, and his family refused to let the world look away." Jordan, who had been listening quietly, shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't do anything. I just got hurt." Angela leaned toward him, her gaze kind. "Sometimes, Jordan, the bravest thing we can do is survive and then let others see what survival costs. That's what you did. And because of you, people are fighting harder than ever to make sure no one else has to pay that price." Marcus placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "She's right. You didn't ask for it, but you turned your pain into purpose." The following week, Luis Martinez invited the Ellingtons to a training workshop he was leading for new flight attendants. They walked into the classroom to find 24 young recruits seated in rows, eyes wide as they recognized the family. Luis introduced them warmly. "This is the family whose courage made this training possible. Tonight, you're not just learning how to serve, you're learning how to protect dignity." He turned to Jordan. "Would you like to say a few words?" Jordan hesitated, glancing at his parents. Marcus gave him a reassuring nod. Slowly, Jordan stepped forward. His voice was soft at first, but steady. "I just want to say, when you look at someone, see them as a person. Not a problem, not a profile, just a person who wants to get where they're going. Like you." He paused, swallowing. "If you remember that, you'll never make someone feel the way I felt that night." The room was silent for a beat, then erupted in applause. Jordan blushed, retreating quickly back to Nadine's side, but she wrapped an arm around him proudly. That night, as they drove home, Marcus glanced at his son in the rearview mirror. "You know, you just trained the trainers." Jordan laughed. "I didn't even say that much." "Sometimes the fewest words carry the most weight," Nadine added softly. In early spring, the Senate passed the act. News outlets hailed it as a landmark step toward equality in travel. On the day of the signing, Senator Elaine Porter stood with Marcus on one side and Angela on the other. Cameras flashed as she declared, "This law is proof that even turbulence can lead to clearer skies when courage guides us." Back home, Jordan watched the broadcast from the couch, Nadine beside him. When Marcus returned that evening, tired but triumphant, Jordan hugged him tightly. "You did it, Dad." Marcus smiled, emotion catching in his throat. "No, son, we did it. All of us." The weeks that followed were filled with invitations to conferences, interviews, and panels. But the Ellingtons began to choose carefully. They didn't want to live only as symbols. They wanted to live as a family. They made time for game nights, for basketball in the driveway, for quiet dinners without cameras. One evening, as twilight settled, Marcus and Nadine sat together on the porch swing. Nadine leaned against him, her voice thoughtful. "Do you ever think about how close we came to losing everything that night?" Marcus tightened his arm around her. "Every day. But I also think about what we found: strength, community, purpose. It doesn't erase the pain, but it makes it mean something. Inside." Jordan sat at the piano, playing softly. The notes drifted out through the open window, weaving around them. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt not just hope, but peace. That summer, the Ellingtons returned to the skies again, this time by choice, not necessity. They boarded together, Jordan carrying his own backpack proudly. As the plane climbed, he looked out the window, the clouds glowing in the sun. He turned to his father and said, "You know what, Dad? The sky feels different now." Marcus smiled, eyes glistening. "That's because it's yours, son. It always was." And as the plane soared higher, Nadine rested her head on Marcus's shoulder. Jordan pressed against the window, and together they embraced the truth they had fought to claim. The sky belongs to all. Life has a way of testing us in the most unexpected places, sometimes at 30,000 feet. The story of the Ellington family is not just about a broken nose. It is about what happens when prejudice hides in plain sight, and how silence can be as damaging as cruelty itself. For older generations especially, this story reminds us of truths we already know. Dignity is not negotiable, and justice does not arrive unless ordinary people demand it. We learn that resilience is not about erasing pain, but about transforming it, turning wounds into movements, and fear into change. Marcus Ellington's strength as a father shows us that leadership is not about titles, but about protecting those you love and standing firm when it matters most. Nadine's quiet courage reminds us that healing requires tenderness, not just power. And young Jordan shows us that even in suffering, a child's voice can become a beacon for others. The lesson is clear wherever life places us: in boardrooms, in cabins, in our own families. We carry a responsibility to see each person fully, to act when injustice appears, and to ensure that tomorrow's skies are clearer for those who follow. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. Stories like this remind us how powerful empathy and courage can be when we choose to act. If this touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep telling stories that matter and inspire change.